For many generations, history seemed complete, clean, convenient, almost too simple. The Sumerians, the first civilization. The people who invented writing, the wheel, the city, the law, the school, poetry, astronomy. The people who appeared out of nowhere in the south of Mesopotamia, between two rivers, and built a world from which all subsequent human history grew. That was what textbooks wrote. That was what museums told. That was how every lecture on the origins of civilization sounded. But there was one detail that never fit into this clean picture. One quiet contradiction that historians bypassed carefully, like a stone one could stumble over. No one really knew where the Sumerians came from. Their language was not similar to any other language in the world, not to the Semitic languages of their neighbors, not to Indo-European, not to Turkic, not to Dravidian. It stood apart, isolated, like an island in a sea of foreign sounds. Linguists call such languages isolates, and Sumerian was one of the oldest and most mysterious isolates in human history. Their myths spoke of an arrival from across the sea, of the land of Dilmun, of mountains in the east, of islands where the gods were born. But the geography of these tales remained as foggy as the morning mist over the Euphrates. Their appearance on statues differed from the appearance of the Semitic peoples who lived nearby. Large eyes, prominent noses, shaved heads for men, long hair for women. Faces that did not fully belong to any known anthropological type. And yet, for more than a century, since the Sumerian civilization was rediscovered in the 19th century, science offered simple answers. The Sumerians came from the Zagros Mountains, or from Anatolia, or from India, or from the Arabian Peninsula, or they had simply always lived where they were found. Each of these theories had its defenders. Each relied on some evidence. Each seemed logical, and none was definitive. That was the problem. Not one answer, but a dozen. Not clarity, but a constant fog. And then data appeared that slowly began to destroy all these theories simultaneously. To understand what happened, one must go back to the very beginning, to before the Sumerians appeared in history. Around 6,000 years before our era, the first large settlements appeared in southern Mesopotamia. Archaeologists named this culture Ubaid. It preceded the Sumerian civilization by approximately 2,000 years. The people of Ubaid built temples out of clay. They crafted fine painted pottery. They traded with the Persian Gulf. They lived in villages that slowly turned into cities. For a long time, it was believed that the Ubaidians were the ancestors of the Sumerians, that the culture developed continuously, from simple villages to large cities, from clay temples to ziggurats, from primitive signs to cuneiform. It was a beautiful theory, linear, understandable, convenient. But there was one problem. There was always one problem. Some researchers noticed that there were strange gaps between the Ubaid culture and the early Sumerian culture. Pottery styles changed, architecture changed, burial rites changed. Even city planning became different. It looked as if at a certain point something happened, some change, some arrival, some new wave of people who brought with them new ideas, a new language, a new faith. The Sumerian texts themselves spoke of this. They mentioned a people who lived there before them, a people they called by various names. And they remembered that they came from somewhere, from across the waters, from the mountains, from a distant land in the east. But from where exactly? This remained a mystery for 150 years. And here begins a new part of the story, a part that became possible only in recent years, a part that changes everything we thought we knew. Genetics. Over the past decade, scientists have learned to extract ancient DNA from bones that have lain in the earth for thousands of years. From teeth, from skulls, from skeletal fragments in burials that archaeologists excavated 100 years ago and placed in museum storerooms. This data began to create a new map of the past, A map that does not depend on language, does not depend on pottery, does not depend on myths. A map that shows how people actually moved across the earth. And when scientists began to study ancient samples from Mesopotamia, from Anatolia, from the Zagros, from Arabia, from India, from the Caucasus, the picture began to change. It turned out that the population of southern Mesopotamia in the early Bronze Age was not homogeneous. It was a mixture, a complex mixture of several ancient lineages that met in one place and created something new. One lineage came from the Zagros Mountains, from the territories of modern western Iran. These were the descendants of ancient hunter-gatherers who transitioned to agriculture approximately 10,000 years ago. They were close relatives of those who later created the Elamite civilization. Another lineage came from Anatolia, from the very places where agriculture spread to Europe 8,000 years ago. These people brought with them wheat, barley, goats, sheep, the idea of a village, the idea of a temple. The third lineage came from the Levant, from the lands now called Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan. These were the descendants of the Natufians, some of the first farmers in the world. And the fourth lineage, the most mysterious, turned out to be connected to the ancient population of the Arabian Peninsula, to the people who lived there when Arabia was not yet a desert, when rivers flowed there, forests grew, and herds grazed. 4 lineages, 4 sources. 4 ancient populations that met in the valley between the Tigris and the Euphrates and created what we now call the Sumerian civilization. But this is not the whole story. This is only the beginning. Because when scientists began to compare ancient samples from Sumerian settlements with the modern population of the Middle East, they noticed something strange. The modern inhabitants of southern Iraq, the marsh Arabs, those who live in the marshes in the south of the country, in the lands where the Sumerian cities of Ur, Uruk, and Eridu once stood, turned out to be genetically very close to the ancient Sumerians. Not completely identical. Over thousands of years, changes occurred, new peoples arrived, mixing took place, but the foundation remained. The genetic trace of the Sumerians did not disappear. It is alive. It flows in the blood of the people who still live on those same lands, catch fish in those same marshes, and build reed huts on islands in the middle of the water. This was the first discovery that shook the old theories. The Sumerians did not disappear. They were not exterminated. They did not leave. They dissolved into subsequent peoples, but their blood remained. The second discovery was even more unexpected. Ancient DNA showed that the Sumerians were genetically connected not only to the population of neighboring regions. Traces of distant connections were found in their genome, connections that the old theories did not foresee. Some genetic markers led east, to the Indus Valley, to the Harappan civilization, which flourished at the same time as the Sumerian one, to the people who traded with Mesopotamia through the Persian Gulf, bringing lapis lazuli, carnelian, copper, and wood. Other markers led north, to the Caucasus, to the ancient populations that lived in the mountains between the Black and Caspian Seas. Still others led south, to ancient Arabia, to the times when the peninsula was green. And certain traces, barely noticeable but present, led west, to Africa, to the ancient populations of northeastern Africa who could have crossed the Red Sea or passed through the Sinai in deep antiquity. The Sumerians were not a homogeneous people who came from one place. They were a crossroads, a knot, a point where several ancient streams of humanity met and created something that had not existed before. This changed everything. The old theories sought one source, one homeland, one point of origin. DNA showed that there was no such point. The Sumerians were born from an encounter, from a merger, from what happens when different peoples come to one place and begin to live together. But this raised new questions, questions that the old theories could not answer. If the Sumerians were a mixture of several peoples, where did their language come from? a language that did not belong to any of these peoples, a language that stood apart from all others. One hypothesis suggests that the Sumerian language could have been the language of one of those ancient populations that completely disappeared, leaving behind only this linguistic trace. Perhaps the language of the first wave of farmers who came to Mesopotamia from some forgotten region. Perhaps the language of coastal people who lived along the Persian Gulf when its level was lower, and there were lands there now flooded. Because this is also an important detail. About 10,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, the sea level rose. The Persian Gulf, which was previously a valley with rivers, filled with water. The people who lived there had to leave. Some headed north to Mesopotamia, some east to Iran, some south to Arabia. Perhaps the Sumerians were the descendants of those people, the descendants of a civilization that existed at the bottom of the Persian Gulf before it was swallowed by the waters. A civilization of which no trace remains, except for myths about an arrival from the sea and a language that resembles no other. This is only a hypothesis. There is no archaeological confirmation yet. The bottom of the Persian Gulf is poorly explored. Underwater archaeology is difficult and expensive, but the idea exists. It hangs in the air, like a question to which there is no answer yet. And this makes the history of the Sumerians even more mysterious, even deeper, even older. Because if their roots reach back to a flooded civilization, then the Sumerian culture was not a beginning. It was a continuation, the legacy of something even more ancient that we will never see again. Imagine for a moment that ancient land. Before the sea level rose, before the first cities appeared, before anyone began to record history. The valley of the Persian Gulf, a wide plain through which rivers flowed. The Tigris and Euphrates then flowed not into the current Gulf, but into a long sea that stretched further south. Between them were marshes, oases, forests. People lived in villages along the water. They caught fish, they gathered dates, they hunted birds. And then, slowly, over thousands of years, the water began to rise. Not catastrophically, not like the myth of the flood, just gradually. Every generation saw the shore retreat a little closer, saw old villages disappear under the waves, saw that they had to move further inland. Perhaps these migrations created the first large settlements in Mesopotamia. Perhaps the Ubaid culture was a culture of refugees, people who came from flooded lands and brought with them memories of a lost world. And when, thousands of years later, Sumerian cities appeared, the first texts appeared, myths appeared, traces remained in these myths. Memories of a great flood, of a land that existed before, of gods who lived in the sea, of the wise Oannes who came out of the water and taught people civilization. Perhaps these were not inventions. Perhaps these were very ancient memories, passed down from generation to generation over thousands of years. Memories of a real catastrophe, of a real lost world. DNA cannot prove this, but it shows that the Sumerians were older than we thought, that their roots go deeper into time, that their history begins not with the first cuneiform tablets, but with something much earlier. Here it is worth stopping and imagining. Imagine yourself in southern Iraq today, in the marshes called Al-Ahwar. This is an ancient land, a land that has hardly changed in thousands of years. Reeds grow out of the water as tall as a person. Narrow boats glide between the islets. On the islands stand long houses built entirely of reeds, without a single nail, without a single piece of wood. The very same houses depicted on Sumerian seals 4,000 years ago. A man in white clothes leads a buffalo through shallow water. A woman weaves a basket from grass. A child flies a paper kite into a sky that is just as blue as it was in the times of Ur. Time is different here. It does not move forward, it stands still. It holds on to the earth like the roots of a tree, and underwater, under a layer of silt, lie the bones of people who lived here thousands of years ago. The first Sumerians, the last Sumerians, everyone who came after them, everyone who stayed. Their descendants still live here. They still catch fish using the same methods. They still build the same huts. They still sing songs that sound strange even to Arabs from neighboring lands. Perhaps words remain in these songs, words from a language that disappeared thousands of years ago, words that no one understands anymore, but which for some reason are preserved in tradition, passed down from generation to generation, like amulets whose meaning has long been forgotten. This is not proof. It is only a feeling that the Sumerians never completely disappeared, that they remained, that their blood, their genes, their habits, their words still live on the same land where their cities once stood. And this is, perhaps, the strangest part of the story, because we are used to thinking of ancient civilizations as something dead, as ruins, as museum exhibits, as something that was and disappeared. But the Sumerians did not disappear. They dissolved, they transformed, they became part of other peoples, other languages, other cultures, but their trace remained, not in books, in blood. And when we look at a person from southern Iraq, at a marsh Arab, at an old fisherman in his reed boat, we are looking at a descendant of those who invented writing, who built the first cities, who recorded the first laws, who composed the first poems. He does not know this. He does not consider himself a Sumerian. He is a Muslim, an Arab, a citizen of Iraq. But his DNA preserves the memory of a much deeper history. And this thought changes everything. It changes how we understand the past. Because the past does not lie behind us like a closed book. It flows through us. It lives in us. Every person on Earth carries within themselves the traces of dozens of ancient peoples, millions of ancestors, thousands of migrations, forgotten wars, forgotten loves, forgotten resettlements. We are all a mixture. We are all a crossroads. We are all a temporary knot in an ancient network. The Sumerians were the first to record this history, the first to leave us words. But before them, there were others. And before those others, there were still others. And so on, into the depths of time, further than we can imagine. Perhaps that is exactly why we so desperately want to have simple origin stories. We want to know where we came from. We want to have one homeland, one root, one beginning. But the truth is not like that. The truth is more complex. The truth is more tangled. The truth is older and larger than any story we can tell. The Sumerians teach us this, not by what they were, but by what we did not know about them, by how easily we believed in simple explanations, by how quickly these explanations collapsed when new data appeared. The old theories were not wrong, they were too small. They sought one source where there were many. They sought one people where there was a meeting of peoples. They sought a beginning where there was a continuation. DNA did not provide a simple answer. It provided a more complex one. It showed that the Sumerians were older, more complex, more deeply connected to the rest of humanity than anyone had assumed. And this is, perhaps, the most important lesson, that the past does not become clearer when we learn more. It becomes larger. It expands. Every new discovery does not close a question, it opens new ones. It was once thought that the Sumerians came from the mountains. Then it was thought that they came from the sea. Then it was thought that they had always been here. Now we know that the answer is all of this together, and something more. They came from the mountains, and from the sea, and from the desert, and from the plains. They were always there, and they appeared. They were one people, and they were many peoples simultaneously. They were Sumerians. But before becoming Sumerians, they were someone else, and even earlier someone else, and so on, into the boundless depths of time. This is a story that has no beginning, only layers, only superimpositions, only an endless intertwining of ancient threads that merge at one moment and diverge again. And we, looking at these layers, can only admit that we know little, that we will always know little, that the past is an ocean and we see only the surface. Somewhere out there in the depths lie cities that we will never discover, peoples whose names we will never pronounce, languages that disappeared without a trace, stories that no one recorded. The Sumerians gave us the first records, the first words, the first names. But even they, with all their genius, with all their tablets, with all their temples, could not tell us where they themselves came from. They did not know, or they knew but could not explain. And so we are still searching, still digging, still reading cuneiform, still sequencing ancient DNA, still looking at the marshes of southern Iraq and trying to imagine what was there thousands of years ago. And every discovery makes history larger, not simpler, larger. Because the Sumerians were not what we thought. Not because the old history was completely wrong, but because it was too small. The true history of the Sumerians is the history of several peoples who met in the valley between two rivers. The history of people who came from the mountains, from the sea, from the desert, from the plains. The history of a language that outlived its people. The history of blood that still flows in the people who live on that same land. This is a story that has no simple beginning and no simple end. It begins in the depths of time that we cannot see, and it continues to this day in the veins of people who do not even know what they carry within themselves. The Sumerians were the first to record history. But the history they recorded was only a small part of their own history. The greater part remained unrecorded. The greater part remained in blood, in bones, in the memory of the earth. And we, thousands of years later, are only beginning to read it. Not with words, not with texts, but with a code that lies in every cell. A code that remembers what people have forgotten. A code that preserves history longer than any clay tablet. The Sumerians did not disappear. They never disappeared. They simply became invisible to us, dissolved into subsequent generations, transformed into something else. But now, after thousands of years, they're appearing again, not as a myth, not as a legend, but as data, as gene sequences, as traces in the DNA of modern people. They are returning, slowly, quietly, through a science that allows us to read the past in the smallest details. And what they are telling us is much more than we expected, much more complex, much deeper. They were not what we thought. They were something more ancient, something we are only beginning to understand. And perhaps we will never fully understand. Because some stories are too large to fit into one book, too ancient to fit into one life, too complex to have one answer. The history of the Sumerians is one of those stories. It was not solved. It was expanded. And the more we learn, the more we understand how little we know, how vast a past lies behind us, how much more needs to be discovered, how much will forever remain unknown. The Sumerians stood at the beginning of recorded history, but they themselves came from a place that history does not remember, from a time that left no texts, from a world that disappeared before anyone had time to describe it. And so, when we look at their cities, at their tablets, at their statues with large eyes, we do not see a beginning. We see the tip of an iceberg, and underwater are thousands of years that we will never see. This makes them even more mysterious, even more majestic, even closer to us. Because we are all like that. We are all the tips of icebergs. We all carry within us thousands of years that we do not remember. We are all the end of long chains that stretch into the darkness. The Sumerians simply show this most clearly, because they were the first to leave words, and the last to reveal their secrets. They were not what we thought, not because we were wrong, but because the truth turned out to be larger than our imagination. And perhaps this is exactly where the true lesson of history lies, not in finding the final answer, but in learning to live with questions that become ever deeper. The Sumerians give us this lesson, quietly, across millennia, through a language that no one understands, through myths that no one remembers, through blood that still flows in the people who live on that same land. They were, they are, they remain, not as a people that can be shown on a map, but as an ancient current that flows into us and flows further, into a future that we will not see. This is their true legacy. Not ziggurats, not tablets, not the laws of Hammurabi who came after them, but the very idea that history does not end, that the past does not die, that even vanished peoples live on, in blood, in language, in the memory of the earth. The Sumerians were not what we thought. They were something much more. And now, after 5,000 years, they are finally beginning to tell us who they really were, not with words, but with the silent code of life, which remembers everything that people